Welcome, everybody. So we are going to talk about the recently released, although not so recent anymore, it was released in 2021, Diversity and Inclusion Standard. It's actually a global standard released by the International Organization for Standardization. It's referred to as ISO, but when you say the organization's name, it should actually be iOS. You can't go wrong, even if you think about it as the International Standards Organization. Ultimately, it is an international body that creates standards on a whole variety of things. And James will talk more about that in the future. At the end of this, if you desire, you can earn a certificate of participation to say that you have at least some rudimentary knowledge about the ISO standard, and you can move on to the next opportunity that we hope to provide, which is to earn certification as an auditor in the diversity and inclusion standard. And that's a collaboration we'd like to speak with you about in the future, but keep that in mind. How they designate standards is with a number. So this diversity and inclusion standard is referred to as ISO 30415. I want to just move on to introducing James. JFK is the founding CEO of the Inclusion Score Inc. He's also, as you can see, an award-winning engineer, economist, author, lecturer at the University of Georgia's Terry College of Business. He's the first Black LGBTQ person to run for a U.S. congressional seat, and he also is chair of the ISO 3415 Diversity and Inclusion Service Management Forum, which is the first global certifying body in the D&I standard. And he also is an editor at Anthem Press. So I also get the pleasure of working with him on an advance funded project. This project is known as the Raising Equity Values with the Inclusive Professional Framework and the ISO 3415 2021 standard, otherwise known as the REVISE project. This project is promoting awareness of the ISO 3415. The ISO standard is ratified with 160 plus countries, maybe even more now, including the US. And we are developing a model or a process for deploying the standard with organizations. And our focus for the REVISE project is specifically engineering professional societies because they really get the idea of standards. And so our co-PIs are ASEE, ASCE, and ASME. And what we're hoping to do is scale this model that we're developing with our engineering professional society colleagues to serve institutions of higher education. So please think about that as we go through our work together today, because what we're seeking is collaborators, maybe for an advance grant or otherwise. So James, if you want to start us off with just talking about what our key topics are.
Gretel, thank you for that great introduction, and hi, nice to meet everybody. This is a briefer. Our core objective is that you leave here understanding what a standard and specifically what an ISO standard is, why they're important, the parameters of ISO 30415, as Gretel mentioned, which is the new D&I consensus or DEI or DEIMB. We mean all the letters when we say it. If I say LGBT, I also mean QIA+. So we'll talk about that standard as a global consensus right now, why it's important from an organizational design standpoint, and what we're seeing not only here locally in the United States, but also globally. And last but not least, we'll cover how you can leverage the ISO standard for your work, which has really been the core objective of this REVISE program that Gretel and I and so many others have been working on for the past few months. We got started this year. We're kind of front ran it a bit a few months before that, but yeah, we're deep into it now, and just really excited to speak with you all about what the ISO standard is and how you can use it. So just what are standards in general, right? When anything and I like to just sum it up this way. You can certainly read what's on the slides, but since the end of World War II, everything that we've done well as a society, we've created some sort of global or local consensus on so that we know that we're speaking the same language. And we do that in academia with how we use language, how we index and codify what things are. But standards also help us identify what good, great, you name it, looks like so that we can evaluate quality. And that's mainly what we're doing here with this standard. It looks like a few legacy standards that have poured into it where we're vetting quality of work over the decades. So it also ensures sort of reliability and again, our ability to communicate across organization and across geo locales. Standards are important though, primarily because they give us a basis to construct both from a qualitative and quantitative standpoint, effectiveness and efficiencies. So we can see what systems actually work. And DEI, if we're going to turn it into a profession, certainly needs that. I think any other profession, whether it be accounting or engineering or you name it, whether it's more scientific or more artistic, have a series of standards that we all normally refer to understand what quality looks like. And so again, like I said earlier, we create a common global language. We provide benefits to companies and organizations of all sorts. So we think about your institutions as companies, just like we would think about Coca-Cola as a company, and just like we would think about the state government or the federal government as a company. These are all organizations made of people that need to operate a certain way. And so our effort to standardize and professionalize what inclusivity is arguably the largest global undertaking ever. I'd say more so than cybersecurity, more so than IT, more so than accounting, more so than manufacturing. Because as we moved into this AI-infused world, we're essentially looking at how we mechanically or in an industrial engineering way deploy people to monitor the technologies that guide our lives. Last but not least, I focus on that last bullet, is that we can use our bureaucracies to insist on certain types of compliance. And standards help us establish what being compliant means if and how and when we identify best practices mentioned previously. And so a little quick history on the ISO. It has a lot of different types of names depending on what language you're speaking. We say ISO or ISO. You may have heard of the ISO before. It currently has about 22,000 standards, and they cover everything from the water you drink to the textiles in your shirts to cybersecurity policy, all the way up to now diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It took us about 10 years. We started at the Society for Human Resources Management around 2010. I was a younger person then. I left, became a politician, went back. And next thing I know, we were at the ISO in Geneva. And around 2019, we really had the standard, but then 2020 happened and the world stopped. And so we published this in May of 2021. A lot of Americans were the leaders of this. Man out of Seattle was our core quarterback, at least back then. When standards come out, there's usually, no, not usually, there's always two documents. There's the standard itself, which is the language of what to do where. And then there's usually a implementation manual or technical specification, as we call it. And so the second green number you see at the bottom is the draft that we think is due around this December of the technical manual, which would give bureaucracies, it would give regulatory bodies, legislative bodies, the ability to look at rigid outcomes from the first standard as they consider compliance, efficiency, and effectiveness at the organizations in their purview. So both numbers are important, but for the sake of talking about the standard, we only use the first number. ISO 30415 is the new label for DEI. If someone says ISO 30415, they mean whatever people think they mean in a more poetic way about what DEI is and or was. This is basically DEI for the non-poets, for the mechanical engineers and the labor economists like myself. So anyway, the ISO is a globally validated standard. You know, when it comes out, it was ratified by 163 countries. So it's not just us working on this and not just us training folks down at University of Georgia and other places, but you know, there's trainings going on and this conversation is happening in India and South Africa and Peru and France, and you name it, right? And so again, it's looking at best practices. The cool thing is, per this standard, is over the past 40 years, we've heard every question with regards to DEI and B. We've databased it. Even if someone is in a silo of an industry or a place where they're unaware about how a thing should happen or work, we know the answer. It's somewhere. It's in our cloud. And so anyway, a lot of that stuff has gone into this standard. The number of people has grown just with regards to who's involved because of this large cohort that we've sort of led with Inclusion Score, which is my company, but we've built this broader, separate certifying body in the DISM forum for it to be democratized, you know, for lack of better phrases, for folks to be able to chime in. All these pretty faces you see are from different places, and we don't all necessarily agree with each other about anything. And so we come together to vet how we produce the standard, how we advise the ISO, and how we scale. And we're having a meeting this October 28th through 30th in Georgia at the University of Georgia's executive campus, which is right in Atlanta. We'll talk to folks later about that, but it's a broad cohort of folks, and it's just more, you know, graphics of that forum. And again, the language really comes from, it's a chip off the old block. You know, when IT was standardized about 20 years ago, we started to call it service management. When manufacturing and QA was standardized in the mid to late 80s, we called it service management. Everything in the modern world, how we deliver services of any sort, whether it's education as a product or something else, we do and vet its effectiveness and efficiency via service management. Whether folks are aware or not, there are a bunch of mechanical engineers behind the scenes building boxes and vectors with how you deliver whatever your core product is. And the graphic that you see here on the screen is what came out of ISO 20000 around the mid 2000s, from about 95 to 05. A similar standard was written for IT, and the majority of our lives, whether we know it or not, is guided by these principles of knowledge management, service cataloging, incident management, change management, all the corporate bureaucracies that we exist under, whether they're actual governments, education institutions, or corporations. So yeah, again, what we do is we build models out of these standardized numbers. And again, we'll get into what fits into the standard so that we can not only leverage the standard to, I think when people hear DEI and they hear standard or they hear framework, I think they normally think about a questionnaire, and that certainly exists. But where this runs forward and past that is based on the core questionnaire. There's a series of actions and to-dos and best practices that, again, we've spent the past 40 years cataloging, which is what we put together in the last 10 of those 40 years, which has turned into the standard produced in 2021. And so the ISO, it really breaks out into, we say, these three big numbers, 4, 27, and 32. There are 4 project types that any organization will deliver with regards to D&I. I'll just say D&I because that's quickest for me, but again, I mean all the letters. And those 4 project types, just to give you some perspective, are trainings. Number 1, you're the training folks to do something that they don't know about, right? Number 2 is data extraction or data collection, whether it's demographic data, that's a good example, or sentiment analysis, that's a good example. Data extraction. The third type is internal infrastructure. So if we think about our affinity groups and things like that, those are examples. And last but not least, external infrastructure. Anything we're doing external to the core group. So joining chambers of commerce, running marketing campaigns, et cetera. Those are the 4 service types. We're going to get back to those in a second. But those 4 have been productized per the standard. And now I'm going to speak like a mechanical engineer, if I may, a bit. What the standard does is it distributes those 4, 1, 2, 4 things, which may have many sub things, through the 27 diversity types. Now, it's not I'm not saying there aren't 8 billion types of diversity on the planet or more, right? New ones being born every day. But these 27 types are protected classes, especially in our global democracies, obviously led by the biggest, which is the United States of America. So these 27 diversity types are protected classes. So it's not just gender, race, age, it's neurodivergence, it's parents, it's pregnant people, it's economic background, it's you name it. And again, these are protected classes, and that's how we identify a minority group. And then last but not least is this number 32. So you're distributing those 4 service types through one or many of the diversity types through the 32 domains of the ISO standard. We're going to get to what these 32 domains are, but those are the functional portions of your organization. So the standard is looking at how your organization exists, whether your organization is a university, a professional society, or again, Ford Motor Company. It's breaking down how the company exists and infusing these things as essentially remedies to problems of sorts. So now we can look at it like engineers, like a flow rate problem. How much of X remedy do I supply and at what volume to remedy X problem, X disgruntled types of employees? Okay, so again, I just want to touch on these 4 project types one more time. We silo them in trainings. These are what we normally see. All of your orgs, I'm sure, have done something like this. This group that you're in right now classifies as one of those project types, right? So you got that, you got data extraction. Anytime you're collecting data about who are you, what are you, how do you feel, how can we better serve this? That's data extraction. Internal infrastructure is any sort of group building that you build to build accountability and honesty about what the actual makeup of your group is. So a women's group, Asian women's group, a disabled men's group, a neurodivergent folks in Chicago who went to University of Tennessee who feel discriminated against because they talk about our accent group. That's a group. External infrastructure would be things like joining professional societies or trade associations or the Women's Chamber, the Black Chamber, the LGBT Chamber that provide supplier diversity and or partnership resources. If you're the American Society for Mechanical Engineers, the National Society for Black Engineers would be an example of external infrastructure engagement, right? So we've codified how all these interactions are, and we're looking at them as product flow rates and how they engage problems that might be identified. All right, so I want to touch on briefly, this may be very small for you all to see, but these 27 diversity types are our best effort to quantify a group as a protected class. We know that sometimes these groups bleed over into others. If you look at gender group and then you add subgroups to gender, they may be ethnic subgroups, they may be racial subgroups, they may be age subgroups. When we look at companies, there may be a Gen Z and a Gen X group, and there may be boomer groups and millennial groups, and you name it. So again, these are those protected classes. That 32 number we mentioned again, per how the standard is broken out, everything falls into their 4 big categories that the standard touches. The first is governance, organizational governance. That's things we do with our executives, the people with money, the people who make decisions, the managers, you name it. The next is usually human resources, things we do with our employees, whatever type of employee they are. The next is product delivery, whether our product is, a service like education or something more tangible like, I don't know, furniture or automobiles. And last but not least is our supply chain or supplier diversity, who's in that supply chain, right? And so universities, they obviously cover all these. They buy goods and services. They operate like small cities. Even the companies that provide light bulbs and toilet paper fall into that supply chain category, and they are impacted by that big institution's priorities on D&I. Those 4 categories break out into 32 subdomains. And those subdomains are broken out between roles, again, which is usually stuff we do with executives that falls into the governance space. And then everything else, HR, product delivery, supplier diversity, all falls into actions and measures. All those groups have sort of 2 prongs. Actions are things people do, and measures are tools and tactics we use to measure things people do. And so again, this is just a graphic of how we try to consolidate what those 32 domains look like, truncated Again, the inner circle are those four big categories that I mentioned: governance, HR, product delivery, supplier diversity. And then the color-coded pieces are breakouts, and they continue to break out. There's a bunch of extra breaky outies of breaking out, it's et cetera, et cetera. And Gretel has, and I think this is brilliant, Gretel, broken out sort of what fits where. The light gray boxes are roles and responsibilities. Again, those are people who often wear ties, right? Male or female or someone with trans experience. And then everyone else does the work, right? You have the supplier stuff in the darker circles. Even other organizational stakeholders are accounted for. So it's not just direct suppliers, right? But sometimes partner orgs that we work with, per the ASME and the NESB example, or like we work with a large sports franchise, and they had a grocery store advertising their walls, and they didn't like some of the stuff that they were doing, or at least their customers didn't. And so it created a real issue in how their communications or their priorities tied into that supply chain. That matters. Two big companies interacting, and they weren't direct suppliers. So just putting that in perspective, the darker gray boxes are, again, supplier diversity, product delivery, and again, all your human stuff, human resources. And so again, if you think about this from a workflow standpoint and how institutions or organizations might engage, the standard, how it gets productized, again, we're essentially delivering these four service types, one or very many of them, right? All organizations usually have at least one of these projects afoot. And they're distributed through one or many, not always all 27 groups, but through one or many of these groups across one or many of these 32 domains of the organization. So they grow into each other and create this air of continual process improvement that allows an organization to evolve itself instead of the old world of assessing, which is, do I get a good staff? This is a work in progress kind of methodology. And again, it's not new. We did this 10 years ago at cyber, 20 years ago at IT, 30 years ago at accounting, 40 years ago at manufacturing, 50 years ago at quality design. So for the past 70 years, we have been gradually building on evaluating maturity and continual process improvement. And now we're here at how do we do it with people? And so again, this is just another broader breakout. Those 32 domains that we mentioned break out into 171 of what we call elements. These are questions that, depending on how you answer the question, it will set into motion a series of actions that might be best practices. And you have two options with those. You can execute the practice, or you can go and discuss the practice, which is more normal at every organization, right? But again, back to that 40-year-old database of you've asked this question before, and we've seen a best practice. It may have been in Seattle instead of Boston, or, Phoenix instead of, Philly, but we know that it exists and we can distribute it to you. I think one of the biggest problems of this industry, if we can call DEI an industry, which I don't think that we're there yet, is there are a lot of passionate people participating, but a lot of novice from a standpoint of implementing and organizing. And so we're leveraging the standard and tools tied to it to deliver people the historical knowledge that they might need, that they might not have, because again, their background is something else. They're an economist, they're an educator, they're an accountant, they're an engineer. And so when we think about why this is important, it's certainly important for organizational design and efficiency in general, but in the modern world, I say this with my economist hat on, you have to make the business case for why we're doing what we're doing. So while this certainly, as the bullets go, informs, and systematizes disciplinary excellence, when we say if we're one of the engineering professional societies, we want excellence in engineering. If we're at an institution, I saw someone ask if I was in Athens, we want excellence in delivery of education in Athens or wherever else folks are, Ann Arbor, or Chicago, or you name it, right? But this is a way of us suggesting that the services and programs that we deliver are of high merit. DEI is greater than or equal to, and I stress on the equal to, merit. It also, provides a foundation and accredited discipline, similar to how we peer review and vet anyone in our current profession and what they're writing, et cetera, this gives us a place to caucus. And we certainly expect and are asking for your help in joining us as we scale this caucus to go, you know what, I do like this, I don't like that. Can we do a deep dive here? Where we see the standard go in the next 20 years will be based on people in this cause participation, among others across the globe. It fosters, accountability and continual process improvement where we're sharing, hey, this is what I'm doing in Idaho. What are you doing in Iowa? And last but not least, and what we're going to get into in some of the next slides, which is sort of where I dwell, is it promotes risk mitigation. We are seeing risks rise at an unprecedented rate, and we have to do the work to wrap our arms around those, literally, if that means a hug, or if that means from a business strategy standpoint, to bring people back to playing nicely in the sandbox of life, because we've seen it benefit so many of us over the course of the past millennia, right? And so the graphic that you see on the screen right now is really the driving force behind the publication of the ISO 30415. Back in 1975, if you look to the far left of the graphic or the bars, if your screen is oriented the way mine is, you see that the S&P 500, that's all 500 companies together, the companies that all of us supply to, even our universities, we're supplying kids there, and the companies that we work with are supplying goods there. Everyone works for the S&P 500, whether they like it or not. They claim that about 17% of their assets are what we would call intangible assets. If you're not familiar, that's economists speak for people. Intangible asset is like, oh, we hired Gretel because she knows everyone and she says something about what works. People are at least going to listen and have a lively debate about it. Whether she's right or wrong, we have to have the conversation, right? And so that intangible asset has an actual value. It's usually an insurance policy. If she worked at Standard & Poor's, they'd take out what used to be, in a more sexist way, coined as a strongman policy. Now they're called directors and officers policy. They put 20 million on her head and say we're at least 20 million more valuable because she's here. Anyway, that was 1975. In 2020, and we'll see this come out again next year, 90% of these assets are intangible. So that's, to put in perspective for you, that's corporate world and corporate America claiming on their balance sheets right now, and it is underwritten in insurance, that 90% of their balance sheets are just people. And that's radically different from the hard assets and product, manufacturing facilities, property that we used to claim back in the day. That's a big, big change. It's probably going to pip up a couple more points next year over these past 5 years if things have been digitized. I want you to keep that number in mind and think about how regulators and insurers are thinking about the fact that companies are just makeups of people if people are disgruntled. This is a regulatory guidance that came out of the New York State Department of Financial Services in 2021, which front ran the publishing of the ISO standard. And it's not a unique practice. We usually publish a regulatory guidance when we want to force industry to be more rigorous in communicating the quality of work. We did this about 10 years ago at cybersecurity. If anyone remembers, companies were getting hacked. They were throwing their hands up, like, we can't manage this. Just give me more insurance so we can pay ransoms and keep it moving. In the insurance industry, via insurance commissioners and regulators like the woman who wrote this regulation that you see on your screen, they said, we just can't afford to keep paying the bill if you're not going to do anything different. And that's what's happening with DEI. And so we wrote this regulatory guidance as a warning, but after the publication of the technical specification, the counterpart standard to ISO 30415, this will start to be enforced with penalties. And the reason the Department of Financial Services Insurance Commissioner in New York matters more than anywhere else is because it implicates everyone who is a well-capitalized company, likely even your universities, because everyone deals with a New York bank, or at least 70% of the well-capitalized world deals with a New York bank. And we do not want to pay the fee because someone's hair got pulled and they got called out of their name, and now they want to settle out of court for $200K, which is a standard number. Actually, $212K is a very standard settlement number. And so what we see that's driving that regulatory guidance that you saw on the last slide are really these two numbers. These are numbers that come out of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 2022 or 2 years ago. So we saw a 20% surge in discrimination charges and grievances. Last year, 2023, we saw a 30% surge. But over the past 20 years, we've seen a regular 5 to 7% pip up in grievances every year. Sometimes it's up and down, like a stock chart. And then it spikes. And these are people raising grievances against companies that we know, organizations that we know. So again, it could be governments, it could be nonprofits like universities, it could be for-profits. It covers the board. But these are the two biggest jarring numbers. And on top of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, we see other governmental watchdogs and policing bodies. To be clear, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a policing body. They're the police. And then these other two orgs, they're also enforcing those protections on those 27 protected classes, or what we call 27 diversity types, like the NLRB, which is in the first graphic, which if you're not familiar, is the National Labor Relations Board, which they're top cop, which they're a cop organization. They say, hey, someone did wrong. And then the Department of Justice sues on behalf of the people, or regular, prosecutor does. And they say that all non-disparagement agreements are null and void. And so what that agreement actually reads, to give you more color, is as long as you're not sharing a trade secret, you can say whatever you wanted about what happened at the organization. And what it does is open up the floodgates for people to tell the story of misconduct. That's number one. On the right side, you see pregnant workers and their rights being enforced because they are also a protected class. And we see the EEOC taking more charges against more organizations on behalf of this class, separate from what we normally think about, mainly women, people of color, you name it, age group, etc. So this is just to give you some examples. The numbers are way up in grievances that are filed against all of the institutions that we're familiar with. And so the standard itself is not just a workflow management standard for how to deliver inclusivity to our organization. Each of those color-coded boxes is also tied to a different type of insurance risk premium. So I'm an insurance guy. The reason I'm down at the University of Georgia is because they're always ranked #1 in risk management and insurance. We do insurance better than everyone. As the breakout that Gretel is showing is right here, right? Employment practice liability, which is EPL is what it means, is probably the nearest to what we would consider DEI insurance. This is the insurance that gets triggered when someone, again, does the forbidden thing, whatever it may be. It could even be what people call reverse discrimination, which is not a thing. It's like saying irregardless, which is not a word. It just means regardless. It's redundant. But the point is that lawsuit still stands and it has to be fought. And so who fights it is Chubb, Zurich, Lloyd's of London, and they don't want to pay the tab anymore because they see that 30% spike in grievances and they can almost anticipate and predict via probability and statistics how many of those are going to turn to claims and what it's going to cost them. And so again, each one of these blocks breaks out into what type of policy gets triggered and who we have to pay. Again, we think about supplier diversity and those third-party vendors that cater to us. In every big city, if your groups exist in any of these big cities, or we think about the American Society for Civil Engineers that we're working with now that build our cities, every big city across the United States, the top 30, have regulatory mandates of big construction companies working with women and minority-owned suppliers because they want to be deliberate about spreading the wealth of building those large projects. And if you lie, or if you miss the mark on delivering that work, you get what's called an ML, or a management liability claim. They're huge claims. To put in perspective for you, if you build $1 billion building, I'm looking at the skyline of Chicago right now from the south side, and every building's $1 billion right now. 10% of that overall cost is usually just insurance. So when you screw up, brokers are chomping at the bit to play in there. But that's a claim. And so again, I just want to make sure that you all are tying the standard exists to be tied to standard practice and risk management, because that is the actual cost of a lack of inclusivity. It's the cost of filing and fighting an insurance claim. And, last but not least, I'll always like to say this is not new. We did this before with cybersecurity, like I mentioned earlier. Everyone just thought, We don't want to change our management practices. We just want more insurance to cover it. I'll say a lack of inclusivity or a DEI risk is the biggest type of cyber risk one can identify, because the worst kind of employee you want protecting your assets is an employee that didn't come here to work today, is one that hates you already. And so if we don't get the inclusion problem right, we never get ESG right, we never get cyber right, and the root of how we underwrite real risks will fall. And in this integrated world, we really can't afford that, because the economy only grows as we further integrate it. I just say this as the macro econ guy in the room. Gross domestic product is just a measure of transactions. America has been the best over the past few hundred years of incentivizing more transactions than any other place. We incentivize individuality and individuals to make transactions with each other, make choices, differentiate those. You want this, I want that, fine. And the economy scales. If we fail to do that in this century, like we have in the last century, we lose a whole lot more than whatever we got going on in our individual orgs. And so, to the big number, the point is, we see this $10 billion number, and these companies at the bottom, some of our biggest partners at Inclusion Scored, people who come and participate at the DISM forum, they're excited for the work that we're doing here with Gretel, with Revise, with the National Science Foundation, because they want to codify and normalize how we deliver change management, because they do not want this number to grow, because it also impacts a broader $500 billion changeover number. And that's the number of people leaving one gig to go to another place every year. It's expensive. The biggest question that we like to break out and ask folks, because everyone has, we get calls every day about a DEI problem, this and that. And we just go, can you quantify, DEI? We can quantify what DNI is or what DNI are. We can quantify how it's delivered. We can quantify how much it will cost to deliver change management. The hurtful secret, but maybe it's the truth among us who do this work, is that there has been a lot of spend. There's an MIT professor who suggests that we spend about $8.5 billion a year in DEI stuff. The problem is it's not actually targeting the problems that we have. And it is because we're not using standard methodology to hone in on problems and mitigate those risks instead of trying to boil the ocean. I get it. When you read a news article, I saw Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock, after George Floyd's murder, he said, I want to hire 30% Black people. As a Black man, I can tell you that many Black people don't even exist. We couldn't all go work. If you want all the adults to go work for Larry Fink tomorrow, we wouldn't even be able to fill up all the seats. BlackRock is a really large company. My point is, we can't boil the ocean. We need to spend our time being methodological and strategic and do this like engineers would in order to get the rest of the 21st century right. So that's ultimately our objective. And again, we'd love to have all of you, whether it's virtually or in person, per Gretel in the revised program, to show you how it's done, why it works. We'll flood you with materials so that you can get how it works. But that is our objective. So we want inclusivity to be a standard practice of corporate change management. And by corporate, I also mean governments and universities. We can't wait to work with you all.
Thank you all. Feel free to email me or James. So glad to have you join us.